Hi, my name is Nicola Jennings. I'm Director of Colnaghi Foundation. Welcome to Colnaghi Foundation Lates, talks with interesting people about new art exhibitions, publications and events in the UK and around the world. Great. Well, welcome to all of you tonight. I'm so delighted that you've all come. Thank you very much. I'm Nicola Jennings, Director of Colnaghi Foundation. We're quite a new foundation. We were set up about 2 years ago. And our mission is to encourage more people to look at and enjoy and study pre-20th century art. And so this is a new strand, Lates. We're trying to have talks with curators and with other figures who are interested in the relationships between pre-20th century art and contemporary art, as we have tonight. Last week we had a talk on antiquities. The curators of the Troy exhibition came. We've got other talks coming up, so I hope you'll stay on our mailing list and keep coming to our events. Tonight it's my great pleasure to welcome Richard Cork and Louisa Buck. Both of them are extremely well-known figures in the art scene, so most of you will know who they are, but I'll just say a few words, brief words of introduction. Richard is the curator of the Young Bomberg and the Old Masters at the National Gallery, a wonderful display in room 1, and has written a fantastic catalogue, and that's going to be the subject of the talk tonight. Richard's an award-winning critic, a historian, and a curator, and he was the art critic of the Evening Standard for many years, and then the chief art critic of the Times. He broadcast regularly on television and radio, and he was Slade Professor of Art at Cambridge in 1989 to 1990, which is a great honour. And Henry Moore Senior Fellow at the Courtauld Institute, and he's acted as a judge on the Turner Prize and many other things. And he's also published many books, but go on Amazon and I'm sure you'll find them. Louisa is a writer and broadcaster on contemporary art. Since 1987, she's been the contemporary art critic at the Art newspaper, and I'm sure you've all seen her column. I always love reading it. And she's she makes regular appearances on the radio and television, including Front Row, Night Waves, and also writes for various magazines, such as Vogue and Art Forum. And she's also written many catalogue essays and books also, such as Relative Values, What's Art Worth? And I think one of your more recent books is Commissioning Contemporary Art, a handbook for curators, collectors and artists. So if any of you are budding collectors.
I've got one on owning art as well, about collecting right. And commissioning, so excellent. You can do the double whammy.
Anyway, without further ado, thank you so much to you both for coming tonight, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, what a treat to have you here, Richard, and your wonderful show at the National Gallery, which I hope all of you have seen already. If not, I urge you to go, and it's wonderfully free. You can walk in and just appreciate. Bomberg and the Old Masters. I mean, if we get the first slide up, one can see Bomberg at his most radical, the mud bath. I mean, it's not an image you'd associate with the Old Masters, but first of all, also, it's an incredibly radical image. I mean, 1914 this was made, and he was in his 20s. I mean, before we go into the Old Masters and your choices for the show, I'm just curious about the man himself, where he came from. Some of you probably know, but this extraordinary background. I mean, complete poverty in the East End, no sort of art background. Father was a master artisan, but, you know, to be making this kind of vision in your early 20s is a phenomenal leap. So before we just go into the show, can we have a little bit of background just about where he came from and who he was?
Yeah, well, he must have been fantastically determined, because life was tough in the East End. He was one of many migrant families who, of course, were coming over at that time in the early 20th century. In fact, the Bombergs came from their native Poland to Birmingham, and that's where Bomberg was born in 1890. But after a few years, they decided to go to the East End, which was a good move for Abraham, his dad, because he did get work as a leather craftsman in London. But huge family, all squashed into a tiny flat.
11 of them?
Yeah, 11 children. I mean, I don't know how they managed at all. And if it hadn't been for Bomberg's mum, Rebecca, who managed to get hold of a little room from the next door flat for David and David alone, because she realised quite early on, when he was a schoolboy, that he had fantastic talent. And one of the things that impressed everybody at school was a copy he did of a Holbein drawing, a portrait of Sir John Godsalve. And he just started going round London, looking at all the richness of the museums and the galleries, and drawing. Incredible moment at the V&A where he's drawing a Michelangelo sculpture, and suddenly John Singer Sargent appears, having had lunch in the V&A, as one does. And going up to Bomberg and saying, and Bomberg just this teenager, you know, drawing away, and just talking to him, and then inviting him to visit his studio, Sargent's studio.
And he was going to evening classes at this time, wasn't he?
And then he had huge luck, because he went to an evening class conducted by somebody that, I mean, you might have heard of. He's called Sickert.
Handy. Made a good choice.
Yeah, brilliant choice. But of course, the family couldn't have afforded to send him to the Slade, so that was the next step. And if it wasn't for the Jewish Education Aid Society, that was the name of this charity, who gave him the money to go to the Slade, he wouldn't have been able to do that. And
then he was able to kick in the lithography job that he was working at Printers. Well, his father made him have a profession.
His father wanted him to be a lithographic apprentice. Yeah, that's right.
Which would have been a kind of obvious profession for a son who was proficient at drawing, but he was able to kick that in and go off to the Slade. Okay, that's really. I just wanted to do a bit of sort of shape forming. Yeah. And now this work and. You know, the other extraordinary radical works you're going to be showing. Let's just have a bit of background about this exhibition. I mean, what inspired you to do this exhibition? Because Bomberg, you don't think about him in association with the old masters at all, and his works don't immediately, you don't think, oh yes, that looks just like a Contorno or a Michelangelo or whatever. And you're going to very eloquently, I know, show us just how much it does. But you know, it's not what immediately springs to mind. So what was your initial kind of inspiration for making this exhibition?
Well, I think when I wrote my book on Bomberg years ago, I became fascinated by the fact that I went to see his sister Kitty, and she remembered the fact that Brother David was crazy about Botticelli in the National Gallery. And then I read a little paragraph by his first wife, Alice, who had this incredible memory of, soon after she met David in the East End, he said to her, okay, I want to get on the bus with you and take you down to Trafalgar Square, and I'm going to show you one painting and one painting only in the National Gallery. And he was very firm with her and took her right through the National Gallery and didn't let her pause in front of anything before he got to Michelangelo, which we'll see quite soon. And I remember being totally fascinated by this and realising that although he was super rebellious, incredibly radical, and made all sorts of dismissive remarks, didn't he?
Well, I love it. I hate the fat man of the Renaissance, he said. You know, so
he didn't like the fat man of the Renaissance.
And what was another one? I completely abhor naturalism and tradition. You know, I mean, and this spells this. I mean, these are strident, angry images. So I mean, I think we'll hold mud bath in our heads. I mean, it was based, but having said that, it does come out of actually observing some empirical reality. I mean, there were the steam baths in the East End that were particularly kind of inspirational to him, the bodies and the sort of cavorting around and all that. So it has got a basis in
yes, there were
observed reality and naturalism, however abhorrent that might be.
They were very popular. They were called Shevzik's Vapour Baths, and they were in Brick Lane, very near Whitechapel Art Gallery. And people used to go there and kind of purify themselves, you know, purgative. And I think the purgative thing actually did appeal to Bomberg, this notion of shedding everything, reducing everything to something like the essential form rather than, you know, the fat man of the Renaissance. But at the same time, I think this painting is strangely prophetic too, because we look at it with hindsight, don't we?
Look at the date, yes.
And we realise that very soon after this was put on view, in the summer of 1914, First World War just began. And if you wanted to sum up the First World War, nobody can, of course, but if you wanted 3 words to sum up the First World War, you could do a lot worse than those 3 words, the mud bath. I mean, it's quite uncanny, isn't it? Quite uncanny. So there's something very kind of warlike about it, as well as it being purgative and peace-like. It's a very complex painting. It's also extremely machine-like. So it's like humanity merging with machine forms, almost robotic, which gives it a kind of contemporaneous feel, doesn't it, too?
And he knew Epstein, didn't he? He saw the rock drill, didn't he?
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
Yes, totally. Yeah.
So we're going to move forward now to the next slide, keeping mud bath ahead. And so from the mud bath to a beautiful Botticelli portrait of a young man, which Bomberg adored.
Yes,
this drawing.
And his sister Kitty, with whom he was very close, she remembered when I went to see her that he absolutely adored this particular Botticelli in the National Gallery. It's a tantalising picture because all we know is that it's a portrait of a young man, but it might even be a Botticelli self-portrait, but we can't pin it down that much. But it is very, very, the more you look at it, I mean, it's a quiet painting, and you might walk past it in the National Gallery in search of something more spectacular, but actually it's a very, very impressive portrait.
And then we look at
and then
his response.
Bomberg said
Bomberg's
to his dad, he said one day, he said, "Dad, I want to do this self-portrait based on the Botticelli, and I wonder if you could design me a shirt which is like the one that the Botticelli young man is wearing." So
I love that he got a special shirt made to match. I mean, that's
so
talk
we
about
have
being a
Bomberg's
fanboy.
self-portrait wearing, as it were, a Botticelli shirt.
And in your exhibition, you actually do juxtapose these 2 works.
Oh, I love the fact
which is
that
so
we're
nice. You
able
can put
to
them side by
juxtapose
side.
them. Yeah, I
the
love
Bomberg
that.
next to the Botticelli.
Yeah.
But also, what's interesting is it's a fantastic drawing, and they're both quite modestly sized. I mean, they're sort of just under life-sized, aren't they, roughly?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that it's a self-portrait and a homage to the Botticelli, but it's actually a copy or a channeling of the gaze of the Botticelli. It's almost like a sort of he's
Very
emulating
much so.
the look. It's
Very
that steady
much so.
gaze seems to be the thing that really inspired him.
Yeah. Whoops, we've moved on.
Well, we can move on now. Why not? Let's let chance take us. But just one last look at that, because I mean that just shows his draftsman proficiency there. And so at this point, where was he in his sort of trajectory? Had he.
Well, he'd probably don't know the exact date of that. It's circa 1913, and he'd probably was about to leave the Slade or has just left the Slade, and it's a moment really because he'd got an enormous amount from the Slade, particularly from Professor Henry Tonks, who was his professor there, who started off as a surgeon and was a formidable draftsman in his own right.
But quite reactionary.
But the problem was that, like a lot of British people, Henry Tonks didn't think that modernism was anything other than rubbish. And he just couldn't take it seriously. And so Bomberg, argued hugely, not only with Tonks, but his other teachers. And soon after he left the Slade in 1913, his friend Jacob Epstein, who was older than him, said, "Why don't you come to Paris with me?" Because Epstein, funnily enough, knew Paris very well. He'd been a student there, having come over from New York. That's where Epstein came from. So he was able to introduce the young Bomberg to people like Picasso and Modigliani. Just extraordinary. He was very, very lucky indeed. Yeah.
So let's move on to the famous Michelangelo now.
Yeah.
So this is the one that he took his future first wife to see. I will show you
future first wife on the bus. And I want you to look at one painting and one painting only, and this was the painting that he wanted to show to Alice, because it was so important to him. And if you look at those kind of thrusting diagonals of the 3 central figures, I mean, even though Christ is dead, he's still full of the most extraordinary kind of physical energy, isn't he? And as for the 2 figures supporting him, well, you can see exactly how the creator of the mud bath could have been very excited by that. And then quite uncannily, top right, can you see in the dark cliff in the distance, there is the unfinished bit of the painting to do with the tomb itself, which is waiting for Christ to be delivered to it. And if you look at the two outlined figures and the shape of the tomb, and then think back to Mudbath, it's quite uncanny actually, that tiny little fragment there might well have inspired Bomberg to compose not only the Mudbath but other paintings like Vision of Ezekiel, which we'll see in a minute. So I think, yeah, Michelangelo was a hero. I think I mentioned that he sketched Michelangelo in the V&A. He was a hero. And another thing about this painting, which I think he would have liked, was the fact that it was unfinished, actually. I mean, it's frustrating to us, isn't it? But this ghost-like figure on the right, almost abstract, so that might well have appealed to Bomberg, even though, of course, it's not a deliberate move on Michelangelo's part. He just abandoned the picture because he was given an even more prestigious commission and he had to rush off and leave it.
It's incredibly dynamic too. I mean, I think the fact it's
It really
unfinished,
is.
they're almost like they're levitating, these figures.
Yeah.
And it is really interesting seeing
Yeah.
them through a kind of Bomberg filter now, courtesy of you. Suddenly I'm looking at this, I'm looking at this in a very different way, with these horizontals, the diagonals. I mean, it is, you do see there's a collection of kind of fragments, a collection of kind of abstract forms in a way that, one wouldn't normally rush to a Michelangelo and look at it in that kind of way.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, as we'll see today, Italian art was, on the whole, the thing that really turned Bomberg on in the National Gallery, but there are paintings like this, the Poussin, the Bacchanalian Revel. If you look at the energy of that, there's a kind of ecstatic energy about it, particularly on the right-hand side, where there's an erotic energy as well. And it's just full of movement. And I was fascinated not long ago. I went to an exhibition of paintings and drawings by Leon Kossoff, who sadly died very recently, at Piano Nobile Gallery in Holland Park. And I was wandering through it, having already supposed that Bomberg would have loved this painting. And there was a very elaborate drawing by Leon Kossoff of this particular Poussin painting. And Leon Kossoff, as I'm sure some of you know, was one of Bomberg's most distinguished pupils when Bomberg became a teacher later in life. So I was fascinated by that particular link. And this Poussin, I think, connects up with, in 1912, I think we can describe this as Bomberg's most ambitious Slade painting done when he was a student there. It's inspired by an extraordinary passage, isn't it, Louisa, from the Old Testament?
It goes into a pit of dead bodies and then resurrects them.
Dried bones. Ezekiel sort of discovers them almost, and then is told by God that these dry bones will arise. So it's a sort of mass resurrection, isn't it?
Astonishing.
Yeah.
And the inspiration also back into the real life again was the death of his mother.
Yes,
Rebecca.
I'm sure that played a part, because in this very year, 1912, Rebecca, who had supported him so much, without whom he probably wouldn't have been able to manage as well as he did, she actually dies at the age of 48, very suddenly. And Bomberg is very, very overcome by this, as one might well imagine. And so the choice of the Vision of Ezekiel, the idea of somehow, somewhere, dry bones coming back to life, would have had a huge appeal to him at this particular point.
And he did do some other drawings, didn't he, which aren't here, but of him sort of a lament, a family lament, as a sort of...
Oh yes, bereavement.
Bereavement, yes, sorry, yes. So these images of sort of, keening figures, sort of prostrate with grief. And I can sort of see that coming through there as well. Although there is a baby being held up by...
That's right, I don't know whether you can see it, but it's just here. A baby being held up by a
So again, rather like you were talking about with the mud bath, I mean, they're very mixed messages. They're very complex, these works. They have many different readings.
They are, yeah. And the figures on the left there, who are clutching each other, can you see just sort of quite near Louisa.
This one here.
Yeah, the kneeling figures.
Yep.
They're embracing in this very sort of passionate way, having rediscovered their life. I think that's funny. It's not seeming to want to go. There we are. Yes, if you look at the embracing figures at the bottom of Botticelli's Mystic Nativity, they have the same kind of interlinked passion that you find in Bomberg's Vision of Ezekiel.
And this Botticelli, of course, was done in his kind of frenetic when he with the Savonarola and the crazy
quite late on,
extreme religion in Florence, and it's all kind of a bit frenetic, and in a way that sort of spirit as well. I mean, perhaps I'm projecting too much, but it seems to me this sort of rather ecstatic, sort of feverish, dervish-like sort of stuff going on. Mixing my cultures a bit, but anyway, seems to sort of feed in to the Ezekiel and the mud bath, that sort of sense of splintered, fragmented, sort of frenetic activity.
Yeah, splinter's a very good word. Yeah. And indeed the ecstatic angels at the top of the painting too. I mean, it's not a big painting, is it? But it's just incredibly intense.
Bursting with strangeness.
Amazing.
And those figures at the top, we have to put in our mind's eye a bit, because you're going to be coming to how they influenced future work as well, aren't we?
Yeah. And soon after he comes back from Paris with Epstein, he embarks on this incredibly ambitious, huge painting, much, much, much bigger than anything he's ever done before. And he's only 22. I mean, this is just such a kind of manifestation of early determination and success. He did go to those evening classes taught by Sickert before he went to the Slade. And one of the things about Sickert, of course, was that he used to use this grid when he was preparing his paintings. He would draw a grid very often over his drawings, but of course when it came to the painting itself, he would usually paint over the grid and leave it there as a kind of underwork. And I think Bomberg is looking back to the notion of the Sickert grid, but supposing to himself, what if I impose a 64 square grid on this thing of In the Hold? What will happen? And the subject of In the Hold is so crucial too, isn't it, Louisa? Well,
this is in the docks. It was the diaspora, wasn't it? It was people coming over. I mean, rather ominously resonating with shipfuls of refugees and immigrants now. Often meeting their fate.
Absolutely.
But there's this sense of so it would have been quite a common thing for him to have seen on the quayside. Maybe even people he knew, who knows, or his family knew, pouring out of these boats where they'd been rammed in probably by profiteering people, getting them out of Eastern Europe.
Yes.
So these tangles of bodies coming out of the Hold.
Tangled bodies, and you really do need to see this drawing in order to fully understand the impact of the painting, because by the time he's finished the painting, an awful lot of that...
Well, you wouldn't put this with it. Tell me why this is such an interesting...
I think we better look at this one first, didn't we?
Yeah.
By the time he does the painting, it's almost as if we're looking at, in a funny kind of way, 64 abstract paintings, isn't it? I mean, he's pushing it to the limit.
But it's so radical. I mean, one looks at the date, and one looks at even what was going on in Paris at the time, one looks at even what was going on with the Russian constructivists at this time, you know. This is like sharp edge, it's almost like op art, you know, you've got this sort of sense of it really being, you know, many decades earlier than you'd imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, and emanating from that drawing, I mean, from that grid. So the grid really takes a huge kind of compositional leap and becomes a really major feature in organising it.
Yes.
With the colour as well. I mean, the colour I think we haven't really talked about very much. I mean, his use of colour is very expressive too, I think. These kind
Spectacular,
of,
isn't it?
well, the use of black and white and then punctuating it with colour. Do we know anything about, did he talk about it or write about it, or is there anything?
No, it's a very challenging picture, because of course when you look at it first off, it's the abstract impact that strikes you. And an awful lot of people who saw it when it first went on view in an exhibition of the London group, they didn't know what was going on at all, because of course Bomberg didn't show it with the preliminary drawing.
He didn't, that's interesting.
No.
Just the painting?
No, just the painting.
And just the painting on
And,
its own, was it the only one that he showed in this exhibition?
In the London group, well, if it was, I think there were only 2 or 3 by him. Yeah.
But it must have been, I mean, what was the reaction then to this? I mean, it's...
Well, the reaction was huge,
Yeah.
and a lot of people thought it was rubbish, of course. But people like Roger Fry, who were very, very influential critics, actually were impressed, and Fry wrote about it, in fact, even though he was not really in Bomberg's camp at all. I mean, Bomberg was not a Bloomsbury
Well,
artist.
post-impressionism, Bloomsbury, and one looks at things of that in comparison to this, it's an
Yeah.
extraordinary, you know, combination.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a different planet, really.
And there's something very explosive about it. It's almost as if everything's being blown up to smithereens in front of your eyes as well, isn't it? So there's something very disturbing about it. And I think that links up probably with Bomberg's desire to stress how disturbing the whole notion of the immigrant experience really could be. Yeah.
He'd also seen a show of futurism, hadn't he, as well, in 1912?
Yes, the
in
Futurists
London?
invaded London in 1912 with Marinetti and Boccioni and everybody really, Bella, everybody came over and had a massive impact. Yeah.
And on him, do we think?
Oh, I think he would have been influenced by them, yes.
But he
without a
refused
doubt.
to join, when Wyndham Lewis approached him to join the British arm of
Yeah.
Futurism, the Vorticist, he
Yeah.
wouldn't have anything of it. What?
No, he wanted to be his own man, really. He shied away from that, which I can understand. But so many, I mean, in that first decade of the 20th century, so many young artists joined groups, didn't they? They joined movements. There were so many isms all over Europe. There were rival isms, all kind of producing manifestos saying that they knew the one and only way forward. Above all, the Futurists. I mean, they thought that they had everything completely kind of sewn up, didn't they? Yeah.
Let's just scroll back to that Leonardo
Oh,
again,
yeah.
because it's such an interesting
Yeah.
work to have put
Yeah.
with,
Well,
with this.
one of the aspects of the In the Hold competition is this notion of outstretched arms and hands.
Right in the centre, actually,
Yes.
you see, yeah.
Yes. Going right across the
Yeah,
middle here.
yeah.
These diagonal arms of the one big man, but also this man here who's lifting up. He's trying to hold what looks like a child or a teenager, trying to help them
Pass it out of the hole,
get
I
off
imagine,
the ship. Yeah. And you've got these 2 hands here who are almost sort of imploring somebody to help them up from the hold, because down in the hold the conditions were very often disgusting, weren't they? Yeah. Long voyages.
So,
Everybody crammed together.
so and he did. So, I mean, how did he admire this Leonardo painting? Do we?
So I think no, he never talked about the Leonardo, but I think the importance of the arm gestures and the hands here is
Yeah.
very, very eloquent, isn't it?
Yeah. So you think he did? I mean, how much time did he spend in the National Gallery? I mean, how often did he visit?
Well, we don't know, and one of the frustrating things is that his first wife, Alice, another memory she had was of Bomberg saying to her, "Okay, Alice, I wonder if you can help me, because I want to actually destroy a lot of my drawings." This is around about 1915. And she describes how he went through a huge pile of his drawings and burnt them one after another. And I have a feeling that they would have been the ones which he might well have executed as copies when he went to places like the V&A and the National Gallery. And now he thought to himself, okay, I don't need these anymore, because all they are is copies of the old masters. Because we don't have any of these drawings
Except
that he
the-
undoubtedly
except the
did.
Self-portrait after
And how
Botticelli.
frustrating is that? It makes me feel totally frustrated. I would love to have had them with me here today to show you.
Well, your amazing eye, picking up on these details, though, I think does the business for us very well.
Yes, and here's
So-
another classic example in the National Gallery of exclamatory hand gestures, arm gestures. Even the figure on the left, who you might not notice so much at
But
first,
raising himself out of his chair.
raising himself out of his chair with these jutting elbows. It's got the same kind of diagonal strength as the Michelangelo, which we saw earlier on. It's an incredibly strong picture, isn't it?
Amazing. And I mean, it's so cinematic, we were saying as well.
It is, isn't it?
And this sense of it, again, I mean, the sort of Bomberg filter now that one gets, you know, that I'm looking at this, I mean, obviously Caravaggio is never undynamic, but I mean, certainly there's elements of this painting that, I mean, I'm even seeing the fruit kind of toppling off the edge of the table, you know, everything is in a state of flux and kind of explosive action, you know.
Very much so. Yeah.
Lights, camera, action, there it is.
Yeah.
And this too is
in terms
amazing.
of outstretched arms, I mean, this is an extraordinary, this Veronese, it's one of 4 big ones, isn't it,
It's
Louisa?
one of my favourites, actually.
In the National Gallery. And you're crazy about it, aren't you?
Well, I love a Veronese blonde, you know, a thundering Veronese blonde. But this one, I think, it's so radical, isn't it? With the, I mean, the composition is what you look at, but also there's these fantastic fleshes, the 2 backs echoing each other, the putti hanging onto her leg. I mean, it's sort of fraught and strange and full of sort of mixed messages again coming through. But also kind of harmonious, too.
Yeah, that's true. And I think the fact that it's on a massive scale might have helped Bomberg, because he did really want to do these gigantic paintings. Yeah.
Oh, which is so ambitious, given how young he was and how broke he was. I mean, even the materials would cost him a fortune to just even be able to do that.
He used to walk in from the East End every day to the Slade and then walk back again, because he needed money for food.
Yeah, save on the bus fare or whatever.
Yeah.
So what are we going to see next? Now El Greco's was a big. Now this annoyingly is not on display in the National Gallery, but was a major. I mean, he was really. This was a very important painting for him.
Oh, I think massively. What happens to Bomberg now is that he goes off to the First World War very soon after his solo show. He had this extraordinary solo show at the Chenil Gallery in the King's Road in Chelsea in the summer of 1914, and he hung the mud bath, the first painting we looked at tonight, outside the gallery so that everybody in the street, passers-by, could see it and hopefully be interested and go into the gallery. And he had this wonderful memory of horses, which of course in those days, 1914, would be galloping up and down King's Road. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? And they used to apparently come around the corner and see the mud bath hanging outside the gallery, and shy, they'd go, it would give them a huge shock.
It's a very good futurist moment, that, isn't it? But having it outside in all weathers, can you imagine? I mean, in England for several weeks, hanging on the street outside the gallery.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's quite a gesture, isn't it?
And then soon after this extraordinary moment when Bomberg had this solo show at the age of 23 in the centre of London at that time, 55 works were in that exhibition, and then suddenly First World War. So Bomberg actually volunteers straight away for the war, and all these works are put into a storeroom. And I remember his widow, Lillian, telling me that they remained there until after Bomberg's death. We're talking about over 40 years. Not only the paintings in the National Gallery show at the moment, but the drawings were all, with a whole load of other things, in the store. There weren't even any photographs of them, so nobody knew about these incredibly important moments in the history of modern British art until 1958, after Bomberg's death, when suddenly people discovered them, and the Tate just got straight in there. And in 1959, they bought Sappers at Work, which is the other painting we're going to see in a minute. And Sappers at Work owes a great debt, I think, to this painting by El Greco, which had been in the National Gallery's collection for some time. Unfortunately, it's on loan at the moment. It's not even in Britain. So we can't actually see it except in reproduction. But it had a huge effect on Bomberg. And there is the Sappers at Work. What happened here is that he had the most awful time in the First World War. He was very, very brave, but by the time the end of the war came, or nearly the end of the war came, He was in a desperate mental state. He'd lost a lot of his friends, including a brother, and he felt he was going mad, in fact, like a lot of people did. And he actually got a gun one day in the trenches and shot himself in the foot. And self-inflicted wounds of that kind were more and more common towards the end of the First World War, because people talk, don't they, about the fact that so many people died, and that's quite understandable. But what is not discussed so much is the mental effect on the people who survived. I remember my grandpa, my mum's father, was a soldier in the First World War, and she always said that he coped with it by never ever mentioning it. And I think that's what a lot of them did, yeah, because they didn't have any psychotherapy or anything like that. But anyway, he was, on the other hand, very lucky, because the Canadian Commission came along, headed by a man called Max Aitken, who would then come to London and become extremely famous newspaper magnate, Lord Beaverbrook. And Max Aitken was very keen on art, and he was masterminding this huge, huge commission over in Canada, where not only Canadian painters, but also British painters, like Wyndham Lewis and William Roberts and many others, were asked to do these gigantic pictures of the First World War.
And ambitious too, to be. I mean, no, but also to be commissioning this kind of work, because it was radical work. I mean, it wasn't establishment stuff at all.
Absolutely. And there was a critic, an art critic called P.G. Colnaghi, who was in charge of the London side of the operation. And Bomberg received this commission. He was going to get paid very well for it. And he worked very hard, immediately got back from the trenches, and produced this. And Alice, his first wife, remembers that they took it along to the Royal Academy and laid it out on the floor for Colnaghi's inspection, and he walked around it and said it was absolutely, completely disastrous, and he used the word abortion. He said it was an abortion, and rejected it completely. And poor old Bomberg, of course, he was in a state anyway because of the First World War. And Alice remembers that she came home the following day and found him just weeping. He was weeping his heart out. He'd collapsed once again. But with her help, he managed to do a second version, which is now in the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa. But this first version was just tucked away in the storeroom for decade after decade. And then the Tate took one look at it. They had a new director at the Tate called Sir Norman Reed, who actually did like modernism. Wow, the Tate likes modernism. Because his predecessor, John Rothenstein, wasn't very keen. Yeah, so they bought this in 1959. And it has a most tremendous impact, doesn't it, in the National Gallery exhibition? It
does indeed. Because it's bigger than it is projected here. I mean, about twice the size as it is. It's massive, but also it's a very different style. I mean, we've lost that abstract, it's figurative. I mean, I know that others had their roots in observed reality, but this absolutely is. It's a different kind of tech. You can see the brush strokes in the original form, and it's looser. It's more fluid. Is that the experience of the war that did this? I mean, the style has quite dramatically changed.
Yes. The war had a massive effect not only on Bomberg but lots of other artists. I mean, if you think of Picasso, for example, a pre-war Picasso is Cubist. Post-war Picasso suddenly is, to a large extent for a few years, neoclassical, isn't he?
The rappel à l'ordre, wasn't it? The return to the
yes.
classical, yeah.
And in terms of Bomberg, what happened to him was, I think he realised during the First World War how much destructive power the machine world had unleashed, and how devastating it was in a way that nobody who'd fought in an earlier war had experienced. And it made him realise that his own fascination with the machine age, which undoubtedly had been at the centre of pre-war pictures like the Mud Bath, he just recoiled from it. And he recoiled not only from that, but from machine age cities, the urban experience. he wanted to get away from that. And of course he discovered a whole new reality in the 1920s when he went first of all to Jerusalem and then to Toledo in the late 1920s, which of course is where El Greco once again comes in.
Yeah, so he goes.
And so he's on his way. He's retaining elements of the machine age here, particularly in the upper half of the painting. But in terms of the figuration you were talking about, Louisa, yes, you're right.
But still dramatic composition. I mean, the El Greco, and again, looking at the old masters as a kind of compositional aid. It seems to be kind of an atmospheric aid and a compositional aid. The sort of the atmosphere of the El Greco, that sort of strange kind of febrile sense that those El Grecos have.
Yes.
You know, you never think of it. The word static never applies at El Greco. You know, it's always a state of trembling, sort of almost hallucinatory sort of quality. And in a way, that seems to be here as well.
And it's not just El Greco. If you see the figure at the bottom of this painting, who's stretching his arm out across from left to right, and then you think back to a National Gallery painting and see the figure at the top, Father Time, who's also stretching his arm out. I'm sure that Bomberg would have looked at this Bronzino and realised quite how much it had to offer. It is the most extraordinary, most bizarre painting.
Well, the contortions, I mean, never mind about the nipple action, but also just the contortions of the body is quite... And actually, I mean, again, you know, sort of disregarding the gender of the main protagonist, but, you know, that great big sweeping sort of almost vertical diagonal form is very much there in the Sappers again, isn't it?
Very much so, yeah. And you may be interested to hear that the next exhibition in room number 1, where the Bomberg show is right now, is going to be devoted to the theme of sin, S-I-N, and this painting is going to be included in the exhibition. But what Bomberg was doing is, I mean, looking at El Greco without a doubt, particularly the figures on the left of the painting here, the traders, I think they play a particular role in the painting of the Sappers at work.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating picture because on the one hand it's a celebration of the heroism of the Sappers. What they're doing is they're tunnelling underground for a long, long way towards a German emplacement in a place in France called Saint-Éloi. And of course, on one level it is a celebration of their strength, their fortitude, their determination, and the fact that they're all working together. But at the same time, once again, it's a complex painting, rather like the mud bath. It has a second meaning, which I think is to do with the vulnerability of a lot of these figures. If you look at this figure, the extraordinary figure here, who's sitting on the left, that's his face, and those are his hands, and they're clutching something in the middle. And he looks almost kind of worn out, doesn't he? So Bomberg would have been aware of that.
He's kind of crumpled, hasn't he, in a way?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Bomberg would have been aware of that. He'd been through the trench experience himself. He knew that human beings are actually quite, you know, they have their limits, they have their physical limits.
And they're sort of folded, these figures, aren't they, in a strange kind of way, folded into the picture plane.
Yeah.
So they're still fragmented. It's still fragmented. It's still abstracted, but it's more expressive in a way. And one thinks maybe that comes from the El Greco, possibly too.
An extraordinary painting.
Yeah.
And I'll never forgive P.G. Conady for calling it an abortion. But there you go.
Well, who remembers P.G. Conady? Now we're looking at a Bomberg. I think that we kind of rest our case on that, don't we? Possibly.
Yeah.
So I think
I don't know what's happening here. I'm pressing the arrow and it's going through everything. Oh, I think we might. Oh, gosh.
We're going in. Back we are again.
Yeah.
And we're kind of coming to the end.
I think this is the final slide.
This is the final slide. And so again, you're looking at the Paiolo. Is this again? This is a compositional thing going on here again, is it not? I mean, it's all these arrangements of limbs. I mean, it's a kind of confection of limbs, isn't it? I mean, poor old Saint Sebastian. You kind of you barely. I don't know. You don't see him so much as you see all the different kinds of elements within this painting.
It's a gigantic altarpiece, And it's by brothers Antonio and Piero del Pollaiuolo, if that's how you pronounce it. And it is a masterpiece of that period, without a doubt. And I remember researching this exhibition and wandering through the National Gallery and just looking at this painting because it's a formidable achievement. It's got the most wonderful landscape, apart from anything else, in the background at the top. And suddenly realising, almost with a shock, that the second figure from the left at the bottom there, who's leaning down and adjusting his arrow in order to shoot St. Sebastian, and you're very aware of not only his legs but his buttocks as well. It's a very strong figure. And if you think back to the Sappers by Bomberg, there is one figure here. The big figure here.
Yeah, the green backside. There.
With the buttocks and the green shorts and the legs. And he's bending over. He's got his two arms here with a spade or a shovel. And it's actually quite uncannily close to the figure of the archer in the Pollaiuolo altarpiece. And it's moments like that that make you realise that although Bomberg is being so dynamic here, he's being his own man, he's being adventurous, isn't he? He's being extreme, even though he's returning to figuration to a certain extent. But at the same time, the old masters are there in his mind. And the ones that he reveres are the ones who in their time were not traditionalists, they were not old-fashioned, they were often young artists of the 15th century, the 16th century, whenever it was, who were doing things as radical, actually. I mean, the Renaissance was incredibly revolutionary, wasn't it? It was a radical time.
And it's so interesting that all the works you've picked are extraordinary and memorable and striking, even ones that one doesn't know so well, have this sort of quality to them where they are sort of, as you say, breaking new ground and not just continuing in a kind of safe trajectory. So it's a wonderful meeting of the Bomberg and the amazing wealth of works that the National Gallery had to offer. And the fact that he went there repeatedly while publicly saying, tradition, But then to him, obviously, they weren't traditionalists. I think that's the point, isn't it?
Exactly.
And they weren't fat men of the Renaissance. They were the kind of lean, they were the angry young men of the Renaissance, or the kind of radical young, or not necessarily angry, but the radical young men of the Renaissance. Well, thank you so much, Richard. It's absolutely fascinating.